Rural and remote Australia is hugely diverse, with communities varying in history, culture, population size, degree of isolation and demographic. As such, practicing psychology in these settings calls for a unique understanding and an ethical approach that is grounded in an appreciation of distinct characteristics of the rural and remote context. Australia is one of the most urbanised countries in the world, with over 2/3 or 69% of the population living in major cities. However, it also has one of the lowest population densities outside of these areas. This includes areas that are classified as inner and outer regional, remote and very remote, under the Australian Standard of Geographical Classification Systems. In 2016, estimates approximated that 1/3 or 32% of all Australia's population resided in rural and remote areas. In terms of land area, the very remote category covers over 5.5 million square kilometres, accounting for 72.5% of all Australian land. A unique culture among rural and remote communities is thought to exist, one which places a high value on productivity, independence and self-reliance. These attitudes make it more likely that rural people will deny or ignore any mental health problems or postpone seeking any treatment. Stigma also makes it more likely that rural people will withdraw rather than seek support. These complexities are exacerbated by the fact that within rural communities there is little to no privacy, a circumstance known as the fishbowl effect. This lack of privacy, along with stoic attitudes and social stigma, have implications to a person and seeking treatment for mental health concerns. It is well known that disparities in mental health exist between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous population, and given the much higher proportion of Indigenous people in remote and very remote areas, it is unsurprising that rates of psychological distress, self-harm and suicide are increasing. Statistics show that Indigenous adults in regional and remote areas are 3 times more likely to experience increased psychological distress. Likewise, Indigenous youth are more than 5 times more likely to report self-harm and complete suicide. It is important for all healthcare providers to ensure cultural sensitivity and competence when working throughout regional and remote Australia. Life's complexities are magnified by the unique characteristics and challenges faced by those living in rural and remote Australia. These communities are often affected by adverse weather conditions, long working hours, a lack of leisure time and high levels of unemployment, as well as lower levels of education. These characteristics can also be intensified by personal vulnerabilities, such as isolation and loneliness, unrecognised or untreated depression, as well as drug and alcohol use. We know that mortality rates increase with remoteness, and people living outside major cities are more likely to have chronic health conditions. Health risk factors including smoking, high-risk alcohol consumption, increased substance use are more prevalent in rural communities and are all risk factors commonly associated with mental health issues. The disparities in health outcomes between rural and urban Australians are well documented, and statistics show that the lack of comprehensive and accessibility or immediate support plays a crucial role. In 2016, the National Survey of Healthcare found that 12% of people in outer regional, remote and very remote communities experienced a time when they needed to see a psychologist but did not. Those same people report that the fact that there was no service nearby was their main barrier. Embarrassment and cost are also 2 barriers identified for those living in these communities. The lack of psychological services has real potential to contribute to low rates of help-seeking behaviour and increased stigma in rural areas, as the lack of exposure to services results in a lack of understanding of what psychologists can provide. Mental health services in these regional and remote areas tend to provide mainstream generalist treatment approaches, usually outreaching from larger regional hubs. Accessing these services may mean that clients must travel long distances, leaving their home, family and work. In 2010, the Australian Psychological Workforce Survey indicated that approximately 5,300 fully registered psychologists worked in regional, rural and remote Australia, comprising of 21.5% of the psychological workforce. Specifically, Health Workforce Australia indicates that 3/4 of all psychologists are employed in major cities, the equivalent of 92 full-time psychologists per 100,000 people, compared to only 55 psychologists in inner regional, 41 in outer regional, and 30 in remote and very remote areas. Such statistics highlight that psychology in Australia is urban-centric. The obvious lack of psychological services compared to the high rates of mental health problems in rural communities highlights the need for improved access to high quality care for Australians in regional and remote communities. The Australian Psychological Society's Code of Ethics is built on 3 general ethical principles: respect, propriety, and integrity. The Code expresses psychologists' responsibilities to their clients, to the community, and the society at large, and defines the minimum expectation with regard to the professional conduct and conduct in their capacity. In recognition of the ethical challenges associated with working in rural areas, the APS has published guidelines of ethical practice in rural and remote settings, which address the following ethical considerations.
The Code of Ethics states that psychological services are provided within the boundaries of their professional competence, including but not restricted to their education, training, supervised experience, and appropriate professional experience. Tension between acknowledging limits in professional competence and the lack of other services available create ethical challenges for rural and remote psychologists. Every town has its own culture, and for competence we need to act from reference of this culture. Rural and remote psychologists deal with a larger proportion of Indigenous clients, who also suffer from higher rates of mental illness. The APS guideline for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people advise psychologists to seek cross-cultural education, collaboration with Indigenous co-workers or community members, as cultural ignorance may be detrimental to clients. The APS guideline to rural and remote psychologists states that a need for psychologists to develop culturally competent interventions for work with Indigenous clients. Take, for example, a rural psychologist accustomed to treating anxiety and depression. They receive a referral for an 18-year-old lady with regards to an eating disorder. The psychologist readily acknowledges she is not an expert in eating disorders. However, declining the referral has the potential to have a negative impact on the client's well-being. Rural and remote psychologists need to be aware that they may be held accountable for taking action and not taking action. Strategies, sound knowledge of resources, and judicious use of appropriate supervision should be incorporated into rural and remote practice. In our example, the psychologist does not have competence for treating an eating disorder. The first course of action will likely therefore be to suggest referrals that could either be over the phone or internet, or anyone she knows locally that could help out. If the client is unwilling to see anyone else, she can provide service under supervision, when the harm for no treatment outweighs the risk of harm from having inexperienced treatment. Again, this is only to be done under supervision.
Another ethical challenge is boundary management. According to Standard B.3g in the APS Code of Ethics, psychologists need to be aware and take steps to establish and maintain proper professional boundaries with clients and colleagues. However, in the APS guidelines for psychological practice in rural and remote settings, the APS also recognizes that the small population in the rural and remote context means maintaining clear boundaries is not easily achieved. Overlapping relationships may be inevitable and not necessarily unethical for rural psychologists. In the real-world situation, it was highlighted that a rural psychologist attended the same social functions and events as one or more of their clients. It is possible for the rural psychologist to meet the client or clients at a grocery store or the petrol station coincidentally because the town is so small and such services are limited. Dual relationships can also include both social and business relationships. These relationships can be shared with people within the same community group, sports group, and work groups. Dual relationships can also refer to situations in which the family members of the rural psychologist have connections with their clients. Next, we look at some ways to manage the challenges of maintaining boundaries. According to the APS guidelines, some of the ways include negotiating clear boundaries with clients by openly discussing the issue of potential dual relationships, developing procedures, preventing boundary violations, and developing mutual expectations from the outset, and implementing strategies for monitoring and dealing with boundary issues regarding encounters with clients in other settings and contexts. These need to be discussed in advance. It might be helpful for rural psychologists to reflect on whether they have explored all alternative treatment options and services available within the community and within the online or telecommunication forum.
Confidentiality is at the foundation of a successful therapeutic relationship. The Code of Ethics states that psychological need to safeguard the confidentiality of information obtained during the provision of psychological services, and the need to take reasonable steps to protect the confidentiality of information. In rural areas, the inadvertent disclosure of information can be a problem. This is because of the fishbowl effect. Everybody is more aware of what everybody else is doing and has those social connections to each other. This also leads to hearing about clients outside of therapy sessions. Take, for example, small communities, people tend to recognize each other's personal vehicles. If a neighbor's vehicle is parked in the car park beside a psychologist's office, this could be a disclosure of them receiving treatment. There have been clients that have voiced concerns about being observed walking to their cars to the entrance of the psychologist's office. The issue of confidentiality is very real, not only to clients but also to the psychologist. In small communities, the lack of anonymity may mean that psychologists are more vulnerable to blame or retribution from clients or their families. Increased care may be required to manage the risk, including the risk to the psychologists. The APS guideline states that psychologists need to be particularly vigilant around issues of confidentiality. It is common for psychologists in small communities to learn more information about their clients than the clients disclose in therapy. In our example, this means that car parks could be hidden behind buildings where they are less visible to the public. Communication about confidentiality issues should be discussed with clients at the first appointment and strategies put in place from the outset relating to foreseeable risks and disadvantages.
The final ethical challenge: isolation. As many rural psychologists are typically the only one in the community, they may face both professional and personal isolation. This isolation poses particular challenges and risks over and above those experienced by urban psychologists. Firstly, the professional isolation faced by rural psychologists. In the APS Guidelines 9.1, it is recognized that many psychologists in the rural and remote settings are the only psychologists in the area. Hence, without continued development and supervision, rural psychologists are at increased risk of making ethical errors and continue to do so. They also may have fewer opportunities for peer consultation than urban psychologists, especially on complex cases. Secondly, rural psychologists also face personal isolation due to concerns with socializing with members of the community. They are more aware that their conduct in the community reflects on the profession. Hence, avoiding community connections and dual relationships may lead to increased loneliness, isolation, and situational ignorance that may undermine the rural psychologist's confidence as they adapt to small community life and establish their career in a rural or remote setting. In the real-world example, a study was conducted on rural school psychologists, and they reported that the long amount of travel time to deliver psychological services to the rural schools may have led to more feelings of isolation. Over half of the respondents in the study spent 30 minutes in their car each day, with 21% spending more than an hour. Now, we look at some ways to manage professional and personal isolation according to the APS guidelines. APS Standard 9.3 advises that if no supervision is available in a small community, psychologists may seek supervision by phone, video conferencing, or through the internet, preferably from a more senior colleague with experience in a small community practice or with a specific presenting problem or problems. There are options for consultation, mutual support, and peer supervision available with the local APS branch. It is important for rural psychologists to monitor their own self-care and resilience and ensure that they have an active life outside work within their local community and make clear limits to availability and informal consultation while off work.
Often, because I'm the only psychologist in this town. So usually how I would manage that is depending on whether it is a crisis presentation. So if it involves any risk to the patient or other people, then I will usually, see that person just to make sure I manage the crisis, and I can also make sure that the referral pathway to the appropriate clinician is done.
Okay.
And I guess in terms of, I'm very much aware of this, of my own professional competence and what's outside of my scope of practice.
Okay. In terms of scope of practice, how do you fit in, working with people from different cultures into that competence?
Yeah. Well, I guess in terms, working in North Queensland, I'm very lucky that I have actually got a really good working relationship with one of the Indigenous worker officers.
Awesome. Yeah.
So that's been really good. And the other thing as well is I'm continuously doing ongoing professional development to really, I guess, enhance my understanding of the Aboriginal and Indigenous culture as well, and the, cultural formulation. So I do a lot of professional development in that area.
Okay.
But also but I guess the other good thing as well is I do come from a culturally and linguistically diverse background myself.
Yeah.
So that's, which is why I'm so passionate working in rural and remote community.
You said before that, the population's around 2,500 people. I'd say that's pretty small. So how do you manage those dual relationships and those boundary issues?
Yeah, well, it does, I guess, working in such a small community, really those situations are expected. It's not really, it's not unusual. So usually the way I manage it is really having that very upfront conversation and really normalizing that this is what it looks like and this is what's going to happen. Really normalizing that, making sure, some people can be quite anxious about it. And, my job is really to make sure that it is normalized.
Okay.
So usually during that initial session, we talk about how are we going to manage multiple relationships or dual relationships, or how are we going to manage, meeting each other in public.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, my blanket rule as well is if anyone, I do not acknowledge any of my patients.
Okay.
But if anyone chooses to acknowledge me, then I will respond back.
Okay, so you really maintain the confidentiality there as well.
Absolutely, yes.
How do you manage issues then where, the grocery store owner might decide to tell you about such and such who bought a bottle of wine and they're in for, alcohol dependence? What do you do then?
Yeah. Okay. So again, a lot of people, I guess for me, it's, living in a small knit community, you do hear quite a lot of different stories. So in terms of me as a psychologist, we practice evidence-based practice and evidence-based intervention. In situations where I will bring information that I might have overheard, really goes back to situation which put my client at risk of self or other people. So say, for example, if someone, bought a bottle of wine, there's, nothing wrong with that. They can be having, dinner at night.
Yeah.
Or, family dinner or something. But if that person, if I'm informed then that person has, is driving under the influence, putting himself at risk and other people, then that's something that I will bring up in the session. If there is a help, knowing more of the background information as well. Yeah.
Okay. And in terms of like your professional and personal isolation, like how do you manage professional isolation?
So I guess professional isolation, in terms of managing that, I have different types of supervision. Okay. So my professional supervision is with my supervisor, who's much more experienced than me and has had quite a long history of working in remote communities as well. So she has a lot of understanding of the different dynamics that plays out in small community.
Does she help you then with your personal isolation? Like, does she help you then like develop strategies regarding your own personal isolation?
I think with the personal isolation, it really comes. Yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon for her to tell me, to validate my experience and to normalize it as well. But I do a lot of peer professional supervision as well, and that's usually either over the phone or through video conferencing as well. So that really brings that closes the gap a bit in terms of that isolation. Okay. But in terms of my personal isolation, I do a lot of I'm continuously reflecting on my practice. So I know, I know that I'm very aware that I need to look after my own well-being as well. So personal isolation will impact on anyone, including myself. So making sure that I do have that balance of self-care and, taking me out of situation where my clients could where it could get a bit awkward, but also making sure that I'm not completely isolating myself either. So it is a balance, but I think, with supervision and self-care and support, I think that's definitely getting better.